In the serene picturesque suburb of Somerville, there lived a family whose happiness was the envy of all who knew them. This was the Spencer family. Thomas, the jovial and dedicated husband. Maria, the loving wife and radiant mother. And their three beautiful children. David, the 10-year-old ever-curious explorer. Emily, the kind-hearted 7-year-old with a love for animals. And little Sarah, a bouncing 3-year-old bundle of joy. The Spencer home was a charming white two-story house, adorned with climbing ivy and blooming flowers, neatly sitting at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was the kind of home that felt alive, like a beautiful poem encapsulating years of laughter, tender moments, and life's simple pleasures. The red-tiled rooftop peaked above the tops of surrounding trees, offering a glimpse of the joy that the house held within. Every morning, the day began with the melody of laughter and the aroma of Maria's pancakes wafting through the house. Thomas, a charming man with a boyish grin, would often playfully tease his wife in the kitchen, stealing a hot pancake from the griddle and relishing it with exaggerated delight. Their loving exchanges, punctuated by giggles and playful nudges, was a sight that warmed the heart. The children would wake up to the sound of their parents' banter, grinning sleepily at each other before scampering down the stairs to join the breakfast chaos. David, the eldest, with his dark hair tousled and eyes gleaming with curiosity, would often discuss his latest discovery with his father, be it a new dinosaur or a mysterious space object. Emily, with her tousled blonde curls and sweet smile, would chatter about the new puppy in the neighbor's yard or the bird she had seen while playing in the backyard. Little Sarah, cherubic with rosy cheeks and twinkling blue eyes, would toddle around, babbling and giggling, bringing an infectious joy to everyone around her. The afternoons were spent in the lush, green backyard, where Thomas would often join the children for a game of catch or hide-and-seek after his work, his laughter mingling with the children's squeals and Maria's admonitions about not getting too dirty. Maria, often found with a book in her hands, would watch them from the porch, her eyes sparkling with love and contentment. Evenings would see them at the dinner table, sharing stories about their day, occasionally interrupted by playful bickering and shared jokes. Maria and Thomas would look at each other over their children's heads, their faces glowing with affection and gratitude for their beautiful, chaotic, and completely perfect life. Nights at the Spencer home were magical. After the bedtime stories and goodnight kisses, Thomas and Maria would sit on the porch, holding hands and looking up at the starlit sky, their hearts full of joy. Their laughter would echo softly through the quiet night, a testament to their enduring love. The tranquility of Somerville continued with unbroken rhythm, but Thomas began to experience an unusual change. It started subtly, a whisper here, a murmur there, like a soft breeze rustling the leaves. Initially, he dismissed these strange sounds as the products of an overworked mind, an echo of a forgotten television program, or perhaps the creaking of their old house settling at night. Life in Somerville was idyllic and serene. The days were long and full of laughter, the nights were tranquil and filled with love. And at the heart of it all was the Spencer family, a family that lived, loved, and laughed together, a beacon of happiness and contentment in their picture-perfect suburban home. Little did they know that their perfect world was about to be shattered and their lives irrevocably changed. Thomas was a man of logic, a well-respected architect in the community, known for his precision and keen sense of reality. Thus, when he first heard the murmuring voices, He was taken aback but shook it off as nothing more than a peculiar figment of his imagination. But as days passed, the whispers grew louder, more persistent, wrapping around him like a shroud. They were hushed voices, dark and sinister, their tones filled with an ominous timbre that left him feeling uneasy. They seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere all at once, echoing inside his head like an unsolved mystery. At first, they were indistinct, mere fragments of sentences, and he strained to understand them, attributing their sinister quality to their incomprehensibility. One sunny afternoon, while playing catch with David in the backyard, he heard the murmuring again. This time, the voices were louder, forming a dreadful harmony that froze him in his tracks. David's surprised call broke him out of his trance, and he brushed it off with a forced chuckle, dismissing his sin's concerned glance. Nighttime became a dread for Thomas. The quiet solitude that he once cherished now became an auditorium for these relentless voices. They seemed to thrive in the silence of the night, turning it into an eerie symphony of whispers. He would often lay awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, his heart pounding in his chest while Maria slept peacefully beside him, unaware of his growing torment. Thomas tried to conceal his experiences, not wanting to worry Maria or the children. His smiles became a little forced, his laughter a bit hollow, but he held on to the facade of normalcy. In social gatherings, he was quieter than usual, often lost in thought, listening to the phantom whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He started losing himself in his work, taking on more projects in the hopes of drowning out the whispers with the noise of his busy schedule. But the voices were resilient, winding their way around his attempts to suppress them, seeping into his designs, his calculations, his sketches. Despite the persistent voices, Thomas continued to push them aside, dismissing them as an unfortunate side effect of stress or fatigue. After all, he had a beautiful family and a successful career. He had always been a pillar of strength, a beacon of sanity. But little did he know, these were the early signs of a battle that was yet to come, a battle not against the world, but against his own mind. The storm was brewing, threatening to dismantle his idyllic world, and he was standing at the edge, oblivious to the impending tempest. Thomas's deteriorating mental state had become impossible to ignore. The whispers that started as a soft murmur had turned into a cacophonous crowd in his head, their sinister utterances echoing through his thoughts day and night. The images he once drew with precision and love became tainted with an inexplicable dread, blurred by the haunting voices that never ceased. His work started suffering, the quality of his architectural designs started waning, and he could no longer hide his distress. Fearing he was losing his grip on reality, Thomas finally gathered the courage to confide in Maria. His voice wavered as he described the relentless voices, the chilling whispers, and the growing sense of unease. Maria, while visibly shaken and worried, comforted him, her reassuring grip on his hand a lifeline in his tumultuous sea of worries. She convinced him to seek professional help. After several sessions with a renowned psychiatrist, Dr. James Milton, the harsh reality came crashing down on them. Thomas was diagnosed with schizophrenia. The word hung in the air between them like a sword, threatening to cleave their once perfect world into 1,000 shattered pieces. His mind, his fortress, had turned into a battleground, an unfathomable reality they both struggled to comprehend. Schizophrenia, a term he had vaguely heard of, mostly in passing or on television. Now, it was not merely a term, but a shattering diagnosis that was part of his life. A life he had built with such care and love was threatening to unravel, leaving him feeling vulnerable and helpless. Dr. Milton, a man of great empathy and understanding, explained the diagnosis patiently. He spoke of symptoms, treatments, therapy, and support, his calm voice a soothing balm on their frayed nerves. But all Thomas could hear was a buzz, like the voices were jeering at him, laughing at his shattered reality. Maria, stronger than he had ever seen her, squeezed his hand, pulling him back from his spiraling thoughts. He looked into her teary eyes and found a determination that matched his own. They were in this together, for better or worse. That was their promise, their pledge. In the quiet car ride home, with Maria's hand firmly in his, Thomas made a resolution. He would fight for his sanity, for his family. His children's laughter, Maria's loving smile, their beautiful life together flashed before his eyes. He wouldn't let this illness destroy his family. As he stepped back into their home, the sound of his children's laughter echoing through the halls, Thomas felt a surge of determination. He would face this head-on. For Maria, for David, Emily, and little Sarah, he would wage this war against his own mind, against the darkness that threatened to engulf him. He would not let his diagnosis define him, nor would he let it destroy the life he held so dear. The battle had just begun, and he was ready to fight, armed with love, hope, and an unwavering resolve to protect his family from the storm that was brewing within him. Life in the Spencer household started taking on a different hue. Thomas endeavored to maintain normalcy, but schizophrenia, like an invisible beast, had begun its merciless hunt. The whispers evolved into deafening conversations, and, worse still, he started experiencing hallucinations. Reality and illusion began to meld, the boundary between them becoming frighteningly elusive. The people he once knew became strangers. His beloved wife and children, his comfort, and his joy began to metamorphose before his eyes, their faces contorting into grotesque, distorted figures. His once familiar surroundings appeared menacing, the shadows cast by the setting sun morphing into monstrous beings. Every day became a struggle, every moment a battle to discern what was real from what was not. He clung onto his daily routines in an attempt to anchor himself to reality. However, his once-loved rituals now felt like burdens, the voices and the hallucinations interfering with even the most mundane tasks. The house that used to be filled with laughter and chatter was now a silent testament to the battle he was fighting. Under Dr. Milton's guidance, Thomas began therapy and started taking medication, hoping to quiet the relentless voices and banish the horrifying hallucinations. He spent hours talking, opening up about his fears, his experiences, his undulating emotions. The sessions were exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but he continued, driven by his desire to protect his family from the chaos that was becoming his life. Maria stood by him, her face etched with worry but her eyes reflecting her unyielding resolve. However, the strain of his condition was starting to affect their relationship. Conversations became sparse and strained, replaced by a deafening silence. The children, too, felt the change. Their once playful and jovial father was now quiet and distant, his eyes often unfocused and his laughter rare. Their home had transformed from a haven of joy to a fortress of solitude and struggle. Despite the medication and therapy, the voices persisted, their sinister whispers and cruel laughter echoing incessantly in his mind. The hallucinations continued, distorting his reality into a living nightmare. His designs, once the epitome of architectural elegance, were now marred by the effects of his disease, his sketches reflecting the turmoil within him. Every day was a battle against the demons in his mind, against the darkness that threatened to consume him. Thomas, however, remained steadfast in his resolve. He clung to the remnants of his normal life, to the love he had for his family, using them as his anchors in the churning sea of his torment. But the relentless voices and unending hallucinations took a toll on his spirit, wearing him down bit by bit. The strain was evident, not just on him but on his family as well. Their smiles were strained, their laughter forced, their efforts to maintain normalcy futile. His once happy family was being torn apart by a battle they didn't understand, a battle that was being waged within him, a battle against his own mind. The night was dark, an ominous cloak that shrouded the Spencer household. Thomas was sitting in the living room, the silence of the house punctuated by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Suddenly, the whispers that had been his constant companions morphed into booming voices, their tone urgent and fraught with menace. The dimly lit room, once his sanctuary, started twisting and contorting, morphing into a nightmarish landscape. His hallucinations became startlingly vivid, more real than ever before. Sinister figures emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms hovering at the edge of his vision. They sneered at him, their laughter echoing through the room, bouncing off the walls and drilling into his brain. He saw them reaching out towards him, their monstrous appendages stretching out, trying to grab him, to pull him into their darkness. Fueled by a desperate need to protect his family, Thomas stood up to face the terrifying specters. Each room of the house held a different monstrous figure, each more terrifying than the last. His heart pounded in his chest, his blood roared in his ears, but he steeled himself, believing that it was up to him to protect his loved ones from these menacing figures. He fought them with all his might, his cries echoing through the otherwise silent house. He grappled with them, punched and kicked, wrestling with the intangible, his desperate attempts to protect his family from the unseen terror filling the house with a chilling energy. Thomas battled his way through the house, room by room, his adrenaline-driven body ignoring the exhaustion creeping up on him. He stumbled, he fell, but he got up every time, determined not to let these figures harm his family. He fought till his body gave out, till the exhaustion washed over him in waves, dragging him down. Finally, as the rosy fingers of dawn began to creep into the horizon, Thomas's energy drained. His legs gave out from under him, his vision blurred, and the last thing he remembered was the sight of the monstrous figures dissipating into the encroaching morning light. Then, everything went black. Unconsciousness claimed him, dragging him down into its comforting oblivion. The house fell silent once more, the remnants of his brutal battle evident in the upturned furniture and scattered possessions. As the sun's first rays seeped through the windows, illuminating the chaos within, Thomas lay there, unconscious, a victim of his night of terror, a victim of his own mind. Thomas awoke to an eerie silence. His body ached with an intensity he had never experienced before, a dull throbbing reminder of the night's grueling battle. The house was unusually quiet, the usual morning sounds of his family absent. A sense of relief washed over him as he attributed their absence to safety. They were unharmed, simply avoiding him after the havoc he had wreaked the night before. He took comfort in this thought, despite the gnawing sense of loneliness it brought with it. His home was a mess, a stark testament to the terror that unfolded the previous night. Furniture was toppled over, picture frames were shattered, their once happy memories now splintered shards on the floor. It was as if a hurricane had ripped through their home, replacing warmth and love with destruction and despair. As the days passed, the silence within his home persisted. The meals were left untouched, the laughter and chatter he once cherished absent. But in his skewed reality, he saw it as his family's way of coping, their method of dealing with his condition. They were simply avoiding him, staying out of his way to stay safe. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but he took solace in the fact that they were, in his mind, safe. Soon, he started noticing the strange glances from the neighbors. Once friendly faces now avoided his gaze, hurriedly shuffling their children indoors when he stepped out of his house. Whispers followed him wherever he went, their hushed voices and sympathetic glances the stark contrast to the cheerful neighborhood camaraderie he was once a part of. The complaints started a few days later. The Johnsons, living next door, were the first to mention it, a faint, off-putting smell wafting from his house. He dismissed it at first, attributing it to the garbage he had forgotten to take out or the remnants of the meals his family left untouched. But then more neighbors started mentioning it, their noses wrinkling in disgust, their voices laced with concern. Despite their complaints, Thomas remained in denial. He told himself it was the smell of his own failure, of his deteriorating mental state. His thoughts were consumed by his struggle, by his loneliness, and the creeping smell of decay was pushed to the back of his mind. In his warped reality, he continued to live in the quiet house, believing his family was simply avoiding him, safe and unharmed. Meanwhile, the stench from the house grew stronger, the complaints escalated, and the whispers grew louder. All the while, Thomas was oblivious to the horrifying truth, lost in his distorted world, far removed from the grim reality of his actions. Weeks had passed since the night of terror, and the house had remained eerily silent. The smell had grown unbearable, a constant, nauseating reminder of something amiss. Yet, Thomas clung to the belief that his family was merely avoiding him, choosing to live in parts of the house he rarely visited since his diagnosis. One evening, guided by an indescribable urge, Thomas found himself standing before David's bedroom door. A room he hadn't stepped into since his symptoms worsened. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The room was untouched, just as David had left it. Posters of baseball players adorned the walls, textbooks lay scattered on the study table, and his baseball glove rested on the chair. But what caught his attention was the bed. David, his eldest, was lying there, motionless. As he stepped closer, the horrifying reality revealed itself. David was not sleeping. His skin was pallid, his eyes vacant, his body stiff. The room started spinning around Thomas as he fell back against the wall, his breath hitching in his throat. He had not protected his family that night, he had destroyed it. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move, to check on Emily and little Sarah. He found them in their rooms, their bodies in a similar state as David's. His heart clenched at the sight of Emily, her face frozen in a silent scream, her sketchbook clutched in her cold, stiff hands. Sarah, his youngest, was tucked in her bed, her teddy bear held close, a horrifyingly peaceful image of eternal sleep. The last room was his and Maria's. His hand trembled as he turned the knob, dread filling his heart. Maria was there, her eyes closed, her face a mask of terror. His beautiful Maria, the woman who stood by him, the woman who promised to fight this battle with him, lay cold and lifeless. Grief, guilt, and horror washed over him in relentless waves as the truth hit him with brutal force. He had killed them, his beautiful family, the people he had sworn to protect. His mind had deceived him, crafting an illusion of protection while he committed an unthinkable atrocity. The sinister voices, once a constant presence, fell ominously silent. His house, once filled with love and laughter, was now a tomb, a haunting monument of his psychotic episode. The stench that the neighbors complained about was not of garbage or uneaten food. It was the smell of decay, the unbearable odor of his horrific act. The realization was crippling. His world, already shattered by his illness, crumbled further, leaving him standing amidst the debris of his once idyllic life. His tears fell on the cold, hard floor, a stark contrast to the warmth his life once held. His cries echoed through the silent house, the horrifying reality of his actions leaving him broken and alone in his silent, decaying world. In the following days, Thomas was a mere shell of a man. His home was now his prison, a grotesque mausoleum to his family, a constant, inescapable reminder of his ghastly deeds. His once happy life was now marred by the horrifying images of his wife and children, their lifeless bodies etched into his memory. Driven to the edge by his tormenting guilt and despair, he decided to confess. He called Dr. Milton, his voice barely above a whisper, his words laced with the weight of his guilt. The doctor, upon hearing his horrifying confession, fell silent, his initial disbelief slowly giving way to shock and horror. Dr. Milton urged Thomas to call the police immediately, to turn himself in. The gravity of his actions, he explained, could not and should not be hidden any longer. Thomas, drowning in guilt and remorse, could only nod. The call ended, leaving him alone in his silent house, his actions echoing in the emptiness. Summoning what little courage he had left, he dialed the police. His voice shook as he narrated his actions, the words a garbled mess of guilt, remorse, and horror. The line went quiet for a moment before the police operator promised that officers were on their way. When the police arrived, they were met with a sight that would haunt them for years to come. The house, once a beautiful suburban home, was now the scene of a horrific crime. The officers moved through the house with heavy hearts, documenting the grisly scene, collecting evidence, their faces masks of professional detachment hiding their inner turmoil. Thomas stood by, his face pale and his eyes vacant. The once strong, loving father and husband was now a broken man, his life irrevocably shattered by his own hands. He watched in silent torment as the officers cordoned off his home, his sanctuary, now a crime scene. The confession brought with it a cruel sense of relief. The weight of his actions, which had been a heavy burden on his soul, was now shared with others. However, this relief was short-lived. replaced swiftly by the realization of the consequences of his actions. His family was gone. His home was now a crime scene, and he, a loving father and husband, was now a murderer. As he was led away from his home, his heart ached with the loss of his family, their memories etched into every corner of the house, their absence echoing in the silent street. His confession marked the end of his life as he knew it, paving the way for a future haunted by guilt, torment, and an agonizing longing for a past that could never be reclaimed. Following his confession and subsequent arrest, Thomas was plunged into a whirlpool of despair. His reality, now free from the delusions of safety and normalcy, was replaced by the brutal truth of his actions. The once ambiguous voices returned with a vengeance, their sinister whispers now echoes of his guilt and remorse. His hallucinations became more frequent, more vivid. They were no longer faceless, sinister figures, but twisted representations of his wife and children. Their appearances were grotesque, their bodies bearing the signs of his terrible deeds. They accused him, their voices oscillating between mournful cries and angry accusations, a relentless assault on his already shattered mind. As his condition rapidly deteriorated, the decision was made to hospitalize him. The psychiatric ward became his new home, a sterile environment far removed from the warmth of his suburban house. His days were filled with therapy sessions and medication, the doctors' faces blurring into each other, their voices mere background noise against the constant torment of his guilt and his hallucinations. His room was bare, a sharp contrast to the lovingly decorated rooms of his home. The sterile white walls, the constant beeping of machines, the cold, hard bed, all served as harsh reminders of his actions. He was monitored around the clock, his every movement observed, his every word recorded. His life was now dictated by schedules and routines, his days segmented into therapy sessions, meals, medication, and rest. But there was no rest for Thomas. His nights were filled with nightmares, his days tormented by hallucinations. His guilt had become a powerful fuel for his schizophrenia, amplifying his symptoms to terrifying levels. In the confines of his room, Thomas was left to face his torment alone. His guilt was his constant companion, his hallucinations his torturous reality. He found no solace in sleep, no relief in wakefulness. His reality had become his nightmare, his life a relentless cycle of guilt, horror, and torment. As he descended further into his symptoms, his connection to reality became even more tenuous. His grip on the world slipped away, replaced by a terrifying world constructed by his guilt and amplified by his illness. His once idyllic life was now a distant dream, a memory fading into the obscurity of his middled mind. His descent marked his transformation from a loving father and husband to a man tormented by his own mind, his life now a testament to his tragic descent into the abyss of schizophrenia. The day of the verdict arrived with an air of ominous inevitability. The courtroom was packed, the collective anxiety palpable. Thomas was led in, his eyes vacant, his demeanor a chilling reminder of the once vibrant man he was. His lawyer stood by his side, a grim expression on her face. As the judge delivered the verdict, the courtroom fell eerily silent. Thomas was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. The ruling ordered him to be committed indefinitely to a state mental health facility, his freedom stripped away as a consequence of his devastating actions. The verdict was met with a mix of relief and despair. Relief because justice had been served, despair because it was a stark reminder of the lives lost and the man broken. As the reality of the verdict settled in, Thomas was led away, his figure shrinking in the distance, a haunting emblem of a life irrevocably shattered. Back in the suburb, the news of the verdict rippled through the neighborhood. The idyllic community, once a haven of joy and warmth, was now clouded by the tragedy. Children no longer played in the yards. Adults exchanged subdued greetings, their lives forever marked by the horrific incident. The house, once teeming with life, now stood silent and empty, a grim reminder of the tragedy.